Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to get into microservices.
Okay.
Specifically, like, how do you wrangle data across all these different services when you need to do like a query?
Right.
Like you've broken up this application for all these good reasons. It's all these little independent pieces.
Right.
But then you need to get like a report. You need to like pull all this stuff together.
It's like each team has a different piece of the puzzle, and then someone says, okay, now we need to assemble the whole picture.
It's like you're baking a cake, but the flour's over here and the sugar's over here and the eggs are somewhere else. Completely.
And it's not just about finding the ingredients. It's about combining them in a way that makes sense.
Right. Exactly. And I bet this whole database per service thing is kind of at the root of this.
Yeah. You've hit the nail on the head.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
So each microservice often has its own dedicated database, right? It's their little kingdom of data, which is great for letting them work independently. But then you need to combine information from these different kingdoms, and it becomes a bit of a data quest.
No more just simple database join. That's out the window.
Yeah, the days of select star from everything are over.
Okay, so how do we even begin to, like, solve this? What's the strategy?
So one common pattern is API composition.
API composition.
It's like having a conductor who brings together different musicians to create a symphony.
Okay, I like where this is going.
So you've got your different services, each with their own API.
Right.
And then you have something often called an API gateway that acts as the conductor.
Okay.
It fetches data from each relevant service, combines it all together, and then presents it back to the application.
So it's like the middleman. It does all the running around.
Exactly. It handles the orchestration behind the scenes.
So let's say I'm on like an e-commerce site, right?
Sure.
And I'm looking at a product, and it's got to show me like the price, my purchase history, shipping options, maybe even recommend other things I might like.
Right.
Is that our API gateway in action right there?
It very well could be. In that case, the API gateway would talk to the product catalog service, your profile service, the shipping service,
Oh, wow.
possibly even a recommendation engine if they have one, and it pulls all of that together seamlessly.
So I am none the wiser. Like I just see a nice product page.
That's the beauty of it. All this complexity is hidden behind the scenes.
That is really elegant, actually.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it's not all sunshine and roses, right? There's got to be some downsides to this approach.
You're right. Every solution has its trade-offs.
Okay, good. So what are we trading off here? What's the catch?
Well, API composition is fantastic for simple queries.
Right.
But when you start dealing with huge amounts of data,
Okay.
like think millions of user records or a massive product catalog, it can become a bottleneck.
Because all that data's got to get combined by the API gateway, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those in-memory joins, they can start to impact performance.
Which in the online world is like death.
Exactly, especially for user-facing applications where every millisecond counts.
So is API composition like completely out of the question then when you've got these massive data sets? Or is there like a workaround?
Not at all. It just means we might need to bring in some reinforcements, another pattern to help us out.
Okay, I like the sound of that. Like what?
So there's this pattern called CQRS. It stands for Command Query Responsibility Segregation.
CQRS. Okay, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tongue twister, but the idea is pretty simple, really.
Okay, I'm listening. Break it down for me.
Imagine you have a database that's handling both updates, like when someone places an order, and queries, like when you're displaying a product catalog. Those are two very different tasks, right?
Right, makes sense.
CQRS is about separating those responsibilities. Instead of having one database doing it all, you might have separate data stores for updates and queries.
Oh, interesting. So it's like having a dedicated lane for each type of operation.
Exactly. That way, you can optimize each data store for its specific task.
And how does this help with our massive data set problem?
Well, if you know you're dealing with tons of data for certain queries, you can use a database structure that's specifically designed for handling that kind of volume.
Okay, so it's like using the right tool for the job.
Exactly. You wouldn't use a hammer to tighten a screw, right?
No, definitely not. Or at least I wouldn't recommend it.
Right. So CQRS lets you use different tools for different parts of your data management.
So going back to our e-commerce example,
Yeah.
instead of the API gateway trying to wrangle all that data for a product page, we could have this separate system optimized just for assembling those product details.
Precisely. And because it's designed specifically for that query, it can be super fast and efficient.
Even with mountains of data.
Even with mountains of data.
That's amazing. So we've got API composition for our quick and simple queries, and CQRS for when we need to bring in the heavy artillery.
You got it. It's about having the right tool for the job.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense now. But I imagine deciding which pattern to use is like a whole other can of worms, right?
It definitely requires careful consideration.
Yeah, because you don't want to pick the wrong approach and then regret it later down the line.
You definitely don't want to end up with a Frankenstein architecture.
Okay, good. So how do we avoid that? What are the key things to think about when we're making this decision?
So it really depends on the specific needs of your application.
Right. Every situation is different.
Right. But some general guidelines can be helpful.
Okay, so like what kind of guidelines are we talking about here? Okay, so like what kind of guidelines are we talking about here?
Well, one big factor is the complexity of your queries.
Okay.
If you're mostly doing simple lookups,
Right.
like fetching a single user's profile, API composition is probably just fine.
Makes sense.
But if you've got complex joins, lots of data aggregation, then CQRS might be a better fit.
Right, because it can be more tailored to that specific query.
Exactly. Another thing to consider is how much your data changes.
Okay.
If you have a lot of writes happening, like in a system with tons of user interactions, CQRS can be beneficial because it separates the read and write paths, so you're not contending for the same resources.
Just kind of like having different lanes for different types of traffic. Keeps things moving smoothly.
Exactly. It's all about optimizing for performance and scalability.
This is really fascinating stuff. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, though.
Oh, absolutely. We've only just dipped our toes into the vast ocean of microservice architecture.
For listeners who want to really dive deeper, you mentioned Chris Richardson's work.
Yes. His book, Microservices Patterns, is a fantastic resource. He covers API composition, CQRS, and a whole bunch of other patterns in detail.
Yeah, I was checking it out earlier. It looks super comprehensive.
It's the Bible of microservices, really. And he also has this virtual boot camp that I've heard great things about.
Really?
Yeah, it's like a deep dive on steroids.
Uh-huh. I love it. I might have to check that out myself.
You should. It's a great way to level up your microservices game.
I'm all about leveling up. Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive, to say the least. We've covered a lot of ground, but I think the biggest takeaway for me is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
I completely agree.
It's all about understanding the trade-offs of each approach and choosing the right tool for the job, or in some cases, even combining multiple tools.
Absolutely. It's about finding the right balance for your specific needs.
It's like assembling the Avengers of microservice patterns.
I like that. You need the right team for the mission.
Exactly. And with the right team, you can conquer any data challenge that comes your way.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap things up. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
We've been talking about microservices within the context of a single application. But what happens when those services span multiple organizations?
Ooh, that's a good one. Like in a supply chain or something.
Exactly. Imagine the possibilities, but also the complexities.
Definitely a topic for another deep dive.
Absolutely. We'll have to add that to our list. But for now, thanks for joining us on Deep Dive. And hey, if you're eager for more tech deep dives, be sure to check out Code Impact Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and all the usual spots. We'll be back soon with another episode breaking down complex tech topics into digestible and, dare I say, enjoyable bits. See you next time.